Welcome to Defense Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: as Trump spooks Europe, Biden stirs global anger over Gaza war. Indonesia's presidential election has high stakes for US and China. Israel's war against Hamas is on a precipice. The world is holding its breath. Why Myanmar is only now enforcing a conscription law it's had on the books since 2010. Austin undergoes new procedures in third hospitalization. As Trump spooks Europe, Biden stirs global anger over Gaza war. Washington Post. Former U.S. President Donald Trump's comments that he would encourage Russia to attack U.S. allies in NATO if they failed to invest enough in their national defense have raised concerns about the reliability of the U.S. as an ally. Trump's statements have been seen as a threat to the Western alliance and its political ethos, and some European critics see him as a convenient tool for Russian President Vladimir Putin. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that any suggestion that allies will not defend each other undermines security and puts American and European soldiers at increased risk. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden has unsettled political elites with his perceived complicity in Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. Biden is reportedly frustrated by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's uncompromising approach to the conflict but has resisted internal pressure to do more to restrain the Israeli campaign. Biden's stance has drawn criticism from European politicians, and the conflict has turned public opinion against Israel and its perceived Western enablers. Indonesia's presidential election has high stakes for US and China. Associated Press. The ongoing presidential elections in Indonesia are of interest to both the US and China given the key economic and political role the country plays in the region. The country has largely avoided criticizing either Beijing or Washington, but has deepened defense ties with the US and received significant Chinese investment. If Prabowo Subianto, the frontrunner in the election, emerges victorious, analysts predict that the country is likely to continue with its neutral policy, given Subianto's public praise of both the US and China. Israel's war against Hamas is on a precipice. The world is holding its breath. The Sydney Morning Herald. US President Joe Biden is pushing for a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war, while Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to press ahead with a military offensive until total victory is achieved. Biden is arguing for a 6-week pause to the fighting, while Netanyahu is considering a ground invasion of the southern city of Rafah. The paths reflect the different aims of Israel in the war, defeating Hamas and the return of hostages. A ceasefire would likely lead to the return of hostages, while seizing Rafah would advance Israel's military goals. Why Myanmar is only now enforcing a conscription law it's had on the books since 2010. ABC. Myanmar's military junta has announced that it will enforce a conscription law for the first time since it was enacted 14 years ago. All men aged 18 to 35 and women aged 18 to 27 will be required to serve for up to 2 years, while specialists such as doctors aged up to 45 will have to serve for 3 years. Failure to comply with the draft can result in up to 5 years in prison. The move has been described as an attack on the country's young people and a pronouncement of psychotic resolve by analysts. Some young people have said they would rather leave Myanmar than serve in the military, and others have threatened to join the revolution forces if forced to serve. The military regime is facing a personnel shortage due to a high attrition rate from battlefield casualties, surrenders, and desertions, as well as a struggle to recruit new members. The enforcement of conscription is seen as an attempt to remove young people who are spearheading the revolution from the civilian population and put them in positions where they are likely to be killed. Austin undergoes new procedures in third hospitalization. Washington Post. Pentagon officials have said that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin will return to work soon after undergoing medical treatment for a bladder problem. Austin had been admitted to hospital on Sunday for the third time since undergoing surgery for prostate cancer in December. The Pentagon said doctors performed non-surgical procedures related to an emergent bladder issue on Monday, adding that Austin's cancer prognosis was excellent. Austin has faced criticism for not notifying officials about his cancer diagnosis and subsequent treatment. Farmers' revolt threatens election year upsets around the world. Bloomberg. Farmers around the world are becoming a key battleground as politicians and far-right groups seek to harness their grievances over rising costs, new regulations, and imports diluting their markets. The agricultural sector has gained prominence as governments tackle the transition to healthy, sustainable food production, with many voters concerned about food supplies and prices. In Europe, farmers have voiced their discontent through protests, blocking roads and demonstrating in cities, leading to some EU environmental ambitions for farming being watered down. In the US, farmers have complained about being priced out by larger companies, while in India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has sought to appease farmers with cash and subsidies ahead of elections. Your evening briefing, Haley assails Trump over NATO remark. Bloomberg. Former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, criticized former President Donald Trump for his comments about not standing in the way of Russia if it attacked a NATO member that hadn't paid its full share. Haley called it a mistake for Trump to side with Russian President Vladimir Putin over America's allies. Bitcoin hit $50,000 for the first time in over 2 years, driven by optimism about the U.S. approval of spot Bitcoin exchange-traded funds. Private equity firms, including Carlyle Group, are tying the pay of dealmakers and senior employees more closely to investment outcomes. Israel launched more airstrikes on Gaza, prompting international condemnation and calls for Israel to do more to protect Palestinian civilians. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was admitted to critical care with a bladder issue. The most expensive multi-strategy hedge funds are keeping most of the profits they generate while clients shoulder their costs. Herbert Wigwe, co-founder of Nigeria's biggest bank, died over the weekend. Trump's plans for a second term and Biden's tough new measures for China are both bad news for Chinese leader Xi Jinping and his struggling economy. Biden and Jordanian king warn of planned Israeli invasion of Rafah. Washington Post. President Biden and Jordan's King Abdullah II have warned against an Israeli invasion of Rafah in southern Gaza, stating that it could create another humanitarian catastrophe. Biden said that the major military operation should not proceed without a credible plan to ensure the safety and support of the more than 1 million people sheltering there. Abdullah was more direct, stating that they cannot afford an Israeli attack on Rafah, as it would create another humanitarian catastrophe. He added that they need a lasting ceasefire now and that the war must end. U.S. officials have privately told members of Congress that Israel is not close to exterminating Hamas more than 100 days into its campaign. Despite this, Biden has not publicly called for a ceasefire, saying that Israel must be allowed to defend itself by rooting out and destroying Hamas's base of operations in Gaza. The joint comments came after Biden met privately with Abdullah at the White House, which was the first face-to-face meeting the president has held with an Arab leader since the Israel-Gaza war began in October. Japan stocks to rise, U.S. futures dip before CPI, markets wrap. Bloomberg. Japanese stocks are expected to rise as markets reopen after a holiday, while U.S. equity futures edged lower ahead of inflation data. The yen remained little changed on Monday, trading at around 149 per dollar. SoftBank Group Corp will be in focus after further gains for ARM Holdings, in which it holds a stake. In other news, the European Union has proposed trade restrictions on about 24 firms, including 3 based in China, that are accused of supporting Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. Bitcoin touched $50,000 for the first time since December 2021. Sanction spread, the Bloomberg Open, Asia edition. Bloomberg. The European Union, EU, has proposed trade restrictions on 3 Chinese companies for allegedly supporting Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. The list of entities facing new sanctions also includes companies registered in Hong Kong, Serbia, India, and Turkey. Meanwhile, Nvidia briefly overtook Amazon's market value before falling back, and U.S. stocks struggled to gain traction ahead of data that is expected to show further disinflation. In other news, the priciest multi-strategy hedge funds are keeping most of the profits while clients shoulder the costs, and the Fed's Michelle Bowman and Thomas Barkin have both commented on disinflation and the need for rate cuts. Furthermore, an article discusses the potential consequences of President Trump's comments about NATO, and another article looks at Indonesia's President Joko Widodo's economic legacy. Finally, e-commerce app Temu spent big at the Super Bowl in an effort to win back U.S. shoppers, running 6 ads and offering giveaways. Observed sales for Temu have been falling in recent months. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world, here to bring you the latest news from around the globe. Let's dive right into it. First up, we have former U.S. President Donald Trump causing quite a stir in Europe with his comments about NATO. European critics see him as a convenient tool for Russian President Vladimir Putin, raising concerns about the reliability of the U.S. as an ally. On the other hand, U.S. President Joe Biden is facing backlash for his perceived complicity in Israel's war against Hamas. His stance has drawn criticism from European politicians and turned public opinion against Israel and its perceived Western enablers. Shifting our focus to Indonesia, the ongoing presidential elections have caught the attention of both the U.S. and China. The country plays a key role in the region's economy and politics, and the outcome of the elections could have significant implications. The frontrunner, Prabowo Subianto, is expected to continue with the country's neutral policy, given his public praise of both the U.S. and China. In the Middle East, the Israel-Hamas war is at a critical juncture. President Biden is pushing for a ceasefire, while Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is determined to achieve total victory through a military offensive. The paths they choose reflect the different aims of Israel in the war. A ceasefire would likely lead to the return of hostages, while seizing the city of Rafah would advance Israel's military goals. Moving on to Myanmar, the military junta has announced the enforcement of a conscription law that has been on the books since 2010. This move has sparked outrage among young people who view it as an attack and a pronouncement of psychotic resolve. The enforcement of conscription is seen as an attempt to remove young people who are spearheading the revolution from the civilian population and put them in positions where they are likely to be killed. In other news, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has undergone medical treatment for a bladder problem. Austin's health issues have raised some criticism, but the Pentagon assures us that his cancer prognosis is excellent. Meanwhile, farmers around the world are becoming a key battleground as politicians and far-right groups seek to harness their grievances. The agricultural sector has gained prominence as governments tackle the transition to healthy, sustainable food production. And finally, we have former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley criticizing former President Donald Trump for his comments about NATO. Bitcoin hitting $50,000 for the first time in over 2 years, and President Biden and Jordan's King Abdullah II warning against an Israeli invasion of Rafah. That's all the news for today, folks. Remember, these are just the headlines, and there's always more to the story. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on these topics. So, what are your ideas? Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.